This ruling harkens back to the darkest days of the Jim Crow era, when Black Americans were kept out of rooms of power. This is one huge step backwards for racial justice and for the health of our democracy. With this decision, coupled with the continued erosion of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court, the voices of the American people are being further squeezed out of their democracy.
I'm so fucking scared.
Don't be scared. We're not gonna let this fly, right?
The Jim Crow laws are being reinstated.
Are we gonna... Y'all finna let... They really sitting up in that courtroom? Let me do some digging. I had to look this up officially because you gotta be joking right now, right? They are not joking.
A court has decided to uphold a racist law, a racist voting dynamic in Mississippi. And they admit it is racist, but they're still going to uphold it anyway.
And their bull feces reason is that they're worried about the crime rate. Let me explain this to y'all. They basically will not have no say-so of who votes for the judges. The white chief of justice would appoint its own judges, prosecutors, public defenders, police officers running a new district. I see the state of consciousness that they're trying to bring us back to. This movie is literally explaining what is finna happen. And it's based on a true story. They about to come together to make their jobs easier. Watch this clip. This woman, because she was living in a bad neighborhood, was falsely accused of selling drugs.
What's happening in Melody is happening all over our country. Drug task forces use military tactics to terrorize poor people.
This is the basic example of what they're trying to push. Watch this clip.
If you plead guilty to felony possession with intent to distribute, you can go home today with a 10-year suspended sentence and a small fine.
But I never sold any drugs.
Then post bail, we'll set a court date.
$70,000.
Or you can stay in jail and await your pretrial hearing in end of March.
That's almost 6 months. I can't do that. I mean, what am I going to do about my kids?
I'm sorry the burden your behavior has imposed on your children, Miss Roberts. That is why I'm prepared to offer you a plea. Under no doubt, if you don't take the plea, we will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law.
They all in the circle. You're basically not going to get any help if they come at you with some legal bullcrap. I'm going to say this. Matter of fact, I'm going to let somebody else say it.
So with that being said, this is a message to all you gang members out here. If y'all have enough common sense to have this person doing this person doing that, this person making the drugs, this person killing folks, this person running shit, this person doing that, y'all have enough motherfucking common sense to start a motherfucking army to protect your fellow people.
And with that being said, if this situation ain't tell you anything, you better know this. Ain't no more acting like how y'all acted after the Black Panther Party was dismantled. The universe is over here working spiritually. We got stuff to do too. If y'all let this fly, and I ain't talking about no riding, because that ain't gonna do nothing in these coded systems that they trying to make. We gotta protect our people. It's time. It is time. We really just need to duck off somewhere. Y'all stay dangerous.
This is so real, and it's incredibly important terminology. There are people alive today whose birth certificates defined them by things that we would call a slur today. People living and making laws in this country were fully born and raised in Jim Crow America, by Jim Crow America. My grandparents, born in and lived a lot of their life in Jim Crow America. My parents were raised by Jim Crow America. I am only one generation removed from Jim Crow America. Too many of our politicians, our lawmakers, the people who interpret our laws and govern our country are old enough to remember this era. They're old enough to remember and be shaped by this era. Why do you think we're saying regression is happening and we're going backwards? It's because we never left.
I should tell you, in Tennessee, a big slice of Black residents in Memphis will now have their votes folded into a white county called Williamson County. Williamson County literally still has a Confederate flag on their county seal. But they'll have just the right size of a slice of Black voters from Memphis to make sure they can never, with our other Memphis residents, elect a member of Congress of their choosing. There's a reason why people are calling this Jim Crow 2.0. This really is plainly an effort to drag us back to the post-Reconstruction era after the Civil War, right? The so-called redemption of the old Confederacy, where the slave states reverted to giving black Americans zero say in their own democracy. And the federal government let them do it.
White man from the South says they saw black people as pets.
As far as the colored people were concerned, I feel that they were a good bit happier than they are now. They had less in the way of material things. But I can remember back in the 20s when I was a small boy, they were always singing at their work. They had a great sense of humor. And now today, they just don't seem to care much about that as they used to. And I think they've lost their sense of humor somewhat, which I deplore.
Mr. Hasty, what did you think we were before you began to think of us as human beings?
Well, in a way, we thought of you almost as a very superior pet. Something, or rather someone, we had to take care of. Because we had to do so much of their thinking for them. We had to do almost everything for them except living their own lives. Anything outside, we had to do for them.
You know, I have never been gaslit this bad. I'm doing research for my paper, and I found out, I didn't know before, that Jim Crow was the name of a character in minstrel shows where they used to do blackface and make fun of slaves. I didn't know that Jim Crow was likely the name of a young slave that the songwriter saw as he was going by on the road, and he said that the man was severely crippled, but still he was dancing, and that became the foundation of Jim Crow. So that musician proceeded to cover his face with tar and perform wearing ripped up rags, and that was the representation of the black community. When white people saw that, they thought that name perfectly embodied the restructuring at the time. They called it the Redemption era, after the antebellum era, where they decided not to pay attention to the 14th and 15th Amendment and just make all these laws that made it impossible to be a person, to have any value. I really didn't understand that all this stuff was so very connected and so, like, in our face. I've been running into a lot of barriers. A lot of the stuff's not written down because they didn't let enslaved people learn how to read or write, and they didn't want them to be able to speak their native languages. They didn't want them to be able to keep this kind of history alive. And I get why, because I'm literally sitting here in a study room by myself, crying in front of my screen because I can't believe they treated people like this and called themselves the civilized ones. So that was just a little PSA. Stay woke, stay blessed.
Over the last few days, I've heard that we're living in Jim Crow. So as a history creator, I thought it'd be irresponsible of me to not even try to back up those claims using history. So I did. And my response to that is not something that I think you would think it might be. I do not think that we're living in Jim Crow. I think we're living in something much worse. That's not voter suppression, that's voter dilution. This video is going to be a little bit different than the ones that I normally do. I am just going off the dome. This is what I've researched. I have no cute, fancy, setup. This is just, it is what it is, but we got to talk about it. But hold your horses, because we will get there, but we just have to start somewhere else, because redrawing districts and congressional maps is nothing new. It's a tactic that's been used for decades. And I'm going to take you to 1980s Alabama. But first, we have to talk about what Jim Crow is and how we got here. The 14th and 15th Amendment was passed. It gave black men the right to vote, to be equal citizens. Now, this did not include black women because we haven't got there yet where women had the right to vote. Fast forward to Reconstruction, and now you have black men earning office and being representatives and changing the landscape of the country in real time. Some were appointed, some were voted in, but nonetheless, the country was diversifying in a way that the majority did not like. Just because slavery was over doesn't mean that racism left with it. So this is when Jim Crow was established. You had literacy tests, poll taxes, economic retaliation, physical retaliation, intimidation, anything you can think of. They just wanted to make sure that black men could not show up to the polls and vote, because voter suppression was the tactic. Because black people were going to go to those polls, they were going to vote, and they had the numbers to actually assign representation that aligned with their interests. That was a problem. Representation was a direct problem to total control. Disenfranchisement was the greatest tool used for people who did not want to see the South or the country change at all. This ushered in the Civil Rights era, which eventually led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act being passed. This banned discriminatory voting practices, strengthened the 15th Amendment, and also added federal protections. One of those protections was preclearance. This is important because it required jurisdictions with histories of discrimination to have to get federal approval to change voting practices. This was a landmark law, and this is also why people thought that Jim Crow died when this was passed. But it didn't die. It evolved. Now, people could not just outright deny black voters or minority voters the ability to vote. So they had to change their tactics, and they did. Voter suppression became voter dilution, and it worked its way up through the decades. Now, voter dilution was always present. It just wasn't the main goal. Now, it had to become the main goal. And it worked quietly in places like Mobile, Alabama, starting in 1911, all the way up into 1980 when it got called out publicly by black voters. The case of the city of Mobile versus Bolden actually caused Congress to act a couple years later. Here's why. Since 1911, the city of Mobile had a 3-person city commission system. These members were elected at large, which meant every single person in the city would vote for these commissioners. On paper, that sounds fair, until you get into how the city of Mobile was districted. It never stopped black residents being able to vote. What it did do was dilute their voting power so that they never really got to choose who was representing their district. The majority did, and that's on purpose. Not the majority of their district, the entire city, a city that was already racially polarizing. And it constantly left these black voters with people who weren't interested in their interests and would not work towards them either. The Supreme Court ruled against them because they said that there was no constitutional violation for discriminatory effect. They could not prove that. And these black voters had no federal protections to help them against systems and structures that they knew were working against them. Mobile had perfected the art of voter dilution. The city could always say that we gave black residents the right to vote. We didn't stop them from coming to the polls, and their voices mattered equally. Their system was designed to look neutral, and you could argue that. What it did, though, was water down the black vote because they knew that they did not have the majority across the city. Congress understood that danger in 1982. They amended Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This allowed voters to challenge election systems that propped up discriminatory results as opposed to discriminatory action, because intent could not be proven. Results could. Mobile versus Bolden was vital to this decision. This case did something important. It exposed a system that was operating in plain sight. It also exposed the evolution of Jim Crow. Jim Crow went from they cannot vote to I can allow them to vote, but I refuse to let their vote have power. We see the evidence of this through 2 terms, one called cracking, one called packing. Cracking is when a district is split in order to reduce its power across the board. An example of packing is putting all the black voters into one district so that you reduce their power elsewhere. Now, does that sound familiar when it comes to these new maps and these new districts that are being drawn in real time across the country? The Voting Rights Act of 2026 does not have the same power that it used to have. That's because the Supreme Court has messed with key provisions like the ones found in Section 4. And this has happened over time. This one in particular did away with preclearance. Do you remember how important preclearance was? So I'll go back to the original question. Are we living in Jim Crow? And my answer remains unchanged. No, we are not living in Jim Crow. We're living in something much worse. And you can see that happening in Tennessee. You can see it happening in Virginia. You can see it happening through the last 2 decades. And you could see it happening most likely in the rest of the states to come. So my question to you and me is, why would they do this and what are we going to do about it? And voter dilution is much more dangerous than voter suppression. Not only does it strip you of your voting power, but it wastes your time. And I say this as objectively as I can. History has the opportunity to repeat itself, but it also has the opportunity to be changed right now. The point is that if we say this is like Jim Crow, but the old version, then technically we are wrong. This kind is wearing a completely different set of clothing. It's cerebral, it's technical, it's strategic, it's a different kind of warfare. And that kind of awareness means that it cannot be fought the same kind of way. And the case of the city of Mobile versus Bolden proves it. So if you call yourself a person of integrity, what are you going to do about that?
Welcome to Black History Month, the White People Edition. Today we're going to talk about Jim Crow laws. And remember, this is for educational purposes only. Trigger warning, this is going to be very uncomfortable for white people. Who is Jim Crow? In the 1830s America, there was a white actor named Thomas Dartmouth Rice who did his acting in blackface or minstrelsy, which is a very demeaning and dehumanizing portrayal of black Americans. And he called his show Jumpin' Jim Crow. And as best we can tell, that's where the name Jim Crow comes from. Jim Crow laws were so serious that white train conductors were actually arrested for seating black Americans in white-only cars, and white landlords were arrested and get put in jail for renting to black Americans. During Jim Crow era, a black American woman who failed to step off the curb to make way for a white man might find that she lost her job the next day or her house was burned down. And by 1910, all southern states had eliminated voting rights for black Americans. Plessy versus Ferguson. But who is Plessy and who is Ferguson? Homer Plessy was a shoemaker, and then some lawyers got together and bought him a first-class ticket to get on a train there in Louisiana. And when the white conductor told him he had to go sit in the segregated car, he was refused. He was arrested with the help of the conductor and some of the white members on that train car. This went all the way through the court cases, and Homer Plessy and Judge Ferguson, Plessy v. Ferguson, where the federal courts end up ruling that separate but equal was legal. And in case you don't think this is still going on, just last year in Tuscaloosa, Alabama at Hillcrest High School, they were doing a play for Black History Month, and the students were told they could not put anything in the play prior to the Civil Rights Act, meaning Jim Crow, black codes, segregation, the 13th Amendment, none of it. And the students protested and walked out, forcing the school board to change their position on it. Yeah, 2023. I'm going to say this over and over. Black history is American history. Have a good day.
Blacks in America did not have the same rights they had today. They were less murderous. There was less break-ins. Why is that? And the data shows they were actually better in the 1940s. It was bad. It was evil.
Hey, Auntie Bev here. In the video clip, Charlie Kirk says, in the 1940s, black people were better off because they were less murderous and they committed fewer crimes. He said the data shows they were better off, even though things were evil. But what he failed to mention was Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were enacted throughout the South during the 1940s that kept black people in their place. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. Black people were denied basic rights. Black people were often lynched, sometimes just for looking at a white woman. So yes, black people may have been better off in the 1940s, but the Jim Crow laws made sure they would stay in their place. Jim Crow. It's a part of history. Research it. Auntie Bev speaks.
We've survived slavery, Jim Crow, systems that were literally designed to destroy us, and we're still here. That's God-given resilience that's built into our DNA. But the thing that's actually slowing us down right now is us. That's the conversation nobody wants to have. And listen, I'm not dismissing the system. It's real. I understand that. Oppression is real. I know that. But we started finishing the job for them. We are the only community that will watch you build a ladder and then get mad you didn't build an elevator for everybody else. We celebrate strangers on social media and then sabotage the people in our own zip code. We'll pull up for somebody we don't know and tear down somebody we grew up with. We'll share everybody else's vision and question our own brothers the moment he gets a little momentum. The most dangerous opinion about your dream isn't coming from your enemy. It's coming from somebody who has your last name or in your same zip code. And what makes it worse is we survived everything they threw at us. Auction blocks, fire hoses, redlining, all of it. We came through it all. And now the thing slowing us down is us not being able to handle each other winning. That's not a system problem anymore. That's a character problem. You can't build a legacy in a community that's allergic to each other's success. Somebody got to go first. Somebody has to climb out and reach back. Not for the people that's trying to grab people's ankles, but to build something worth coming back to. We came through everything they built to break us. Don't let what breaks us now be us.
obviously the Black community does not need me to speak for them. But I will say on behalf of the white community that finds, segregation nauseating, that found Jim Crow horrible, that feels embarrassed that is such a huge part of our history from slavery on, I think if we don't do something now, America's going to look a lot like it did during segregation. The Republicans that control the government in Louisiana, nearly every other southern state, they're going to use this decision the Supreme Court just made as aggressively as possible to reshape the political landscape, to wipe out as much Black representation as they possibly can. And everyone, it doesn't matter what color your skin, if you feel sickened by the history of our country and what we have done to people, then this is the time to say we're not doing this anymore, because this is a nightmare, but we absolutely cannot stop fighting.
Imagine growing up in a world where every corner, every sign, every rule tells you that you don't belong. That was childhood under Jim Crow for Black children. It started with the basics: segregation. Kids couldn't drink from the same water fountains. They couldn't play in the same parks or even check out books from the same libraries as white kids, and their libraries were not very well shelved. This sent the message early and often that you're separate and you're less than. In school, the lessons were just as brutal. Black children sat in overcrowded classrooms, sometimes with broken desks and ragged hand-me-down books from white schools. Teachers were paid less, resources were thin, and the whole setup said, you aren't meant to thrive. But the damage wasn't just about what they lacked. It was also about what they lived with every day. The constant threat of racial violence, knowing that a simple mistake, like walking on the wrong sidewalk or making eye contact with the wrong person, could put their lives in danger. That shaped how Black children saw themselves and the world. And that stress didn't stop when the school bell rang, of course. Jim Crow reached into every part of childhood. The games, the friendships, and the dreams little kids dared to hold. I'm not an expert, but I'm an avid learner, and I depend on your comments to help me learn. My username works as my address, too, in case I disappear from here. Share with a white person. Check out the link in my bio. One share shows you care, and one repost helps this truth reach more folks. Get curious.
Everybody, watch this.
I'm seeing a lot of talk from my colleagues on the left, too, as we shift toward this reinvigorated talk about Jim Crow and the past of this country. And as someone who is a direct descendant of a slave, as someone whose great-great-grandfather was born on a plantation, I can assure you slavery is over. Jim Crow is dead. When I go anywhere, I don't see any white-only signs. I don't, I promise you. I am a Black man that represents a white majority district in Texas. The great-great-grandson of a man born on a plantation stands before you today as a proud conservative Republican from Texas, as a believer and follower in Christ, and as a believer in what this country can be if we allow equality for not just Muslim Americans, not just Buddhist Americans, but also Christian Americans like yourself. God bless you, young man. You give me a...
What kind of self-hating you-know-whatery is going on? There's so much to... I'll let it stand for itself. Wow. Wow.
Today we're going to talk about Jim Crow and whether or not it was based on an actual person. The term Jim Crow derives from early 19th century minstrel shows. It was a popular form of entertainment which is the predecessor to vaudeville. The shows consisted of a primarily white song and dance performer crudely mimicking African Americans for the enjoyment of white audiences. One of the earliest and most famous was Thomas Daddy Rice, who devised a strutting, dancing character supposedly mimicking a prancing crow, and the character became known as Jim Crow. How the character named Jim Crow became a general term for America's racial segregation and discrimination is not known, but at some point during the 19th century, the term ceased to have anything to do with minstrel shows because their popularity had started to wane and instead signified the practice of disenfranchising, physically discriminating against African Americans.